Hi folks, and welcome back to Contract Law. This is video 4 in the video series on remedies. And in video 1 and 2 we had a look at damages at common law. In video 3 we had a short and sweet look at equitable remedies, and in this video we will look at restitutionary remedies. So jumping in, what's it all about? Good question, I'm glad you asked. Essentially, restitution is all about unjust enrichment. Okay, what you're doing is you're asking the court to restore some kind of benefit that was provided to the other party where it's unjust for them to keep it without paying for it. Now, this is very different to damages in contract because you're not actually pointing a finger at the other party's breach. You're not focusing on recovery of your loss due to the other party's default. You're focusing on the injustice of the other party keeping what they've got without paying for it. Generally speaking, restitutionary remedies will not be available if a valid contract is on foot. So it's available for void, unenforceable or terminated contracts as a means of getting your money back. It's not a cause of action per se. We call it a unifying legal concept. What about this whole idea of unjust enrichment and injustice? It's not just a fuzzy idea. It's not just a get out of jail free card that the court will hand you if they think that you've had a hard time. It really comes down to a number of enumerated heads that the court has recognised as being against conscience. You need to allege a specific unjust ground, so you need to link your claim for restitution of your money to some kind of mistake, or the fact that the contract was void, or some other vitiating factor or frustration, for example, or the contract was anticipated but never eventuated. And we'll flesh this whole concept out by looking first at the elements of an action in restitution, and then we'll look at some of the big ticket items in restitutionary remedies: total failure of consideration and quantum merit. We'll also have a quick look at some defences there. So that's the plan of action here today. Now, when we say the defendant has to be enriched, what exactly are we talking about? The enrichment can be by way of money, that's fairly obvious. It can be by way of services, and here we need to ask a few things. You need to ask whether the services were requested. If they were requested, then the law is going to presume that the defendant obtained the benefit. This always makes me think of the windscreen washer people. Sometimes you get teenagers that wait at traffic lights and stand there ready, poised for the light to go red, and without even asking you, they will wash your windscreen and then demand payment. It's happened to me, folks. So in that circumstance, obviously you hadn't requested the service, so there's certainly no injustice in you refusing payment. The next thing you need to ask yourself is whether the defendant freely accepted the benefit, and here we have a couple of interesting cases to compare. The first one is Sumter and Hedges, and in that case, Sumter agreed to build a couple of houses and some stables for Hedges, and partway into the building work, Sumter ran out of money and walked off the job, said he wasn't going to complete. The court held that he abandoned the job. Hedges, the landowner, was left in a bit of a tricky situation at that point. Obviously, he had some partly constructed buildings on his land, couldn't exactly dismantle them all and reject them and give them back to Sumter at that point. So what do you do in that kind of situation? Well, he completed the job himself. At that point, Mr. Sumter then decides to sue for the building work, and the immediate hurdle for Sumter was that he couldn't claim on the contract because the contract was an entire contract. The court held it was entire. So you'll recall the distinction between entire and divisible contracts from our discussion on performance in another video series. And so claiming in contract was out. Mr. Sumter then decided to try and ask the court for a quantum meruit, that is a reasonable payment for the work that was done. At that point, the court has a good hard look at what Mr. Hedges, the landowner, had freely accepted and what he had not freely accepted. The court said he had accepted the use of the building materials that had been left on his site to complete the job, but he hadn't accepted the work that had been done in partially constructing those buildings when the builder walked off the job. He really had no choice at that point but to accept the work that had been done. So no payment in quantum meruit to the builder and no payment in contract to the builder. The builder got nothing. Steele and Tardiani was another case that we looked at on the week on performance. And in that case, you'll recall some labourers had cut some timber down for a landowner, and the timber was to be cut to certain dimensions. You'll recall much of the timber was not cut to the right dimensions. The court had to work out whether it was an entire or divisible contract. The court found that it was a divisible contract, and so the workers could claim for those portions of the contract that had been performed substantially. Nevertheless, the landowner had not only accepted the timber that had been cut to the right dimensions, he basically accepted the whole lot. So the workers asked the court to be paid on a quantum meruit for the other timber that had been accepted by the landowner, and that's exactly what they got, a quantum meruit, reasonable payment for the work that had been done. So that's the issue of free acceptance. The last thing you need to ask yourself in terms of services is whether the defendant got an incontrovertible benefit. And here you might find the services might have rendered a positive gain to the other parties. Well, you might find that the enrichment consists in a saving. So that's just something to bear in mind. The issue with enrichment and goods is that there's not too much scope to claiming restitution wherever the other party has been enriched by the receipt of goods. If you think about it, if the defendant has requested goods, they've been delivered, and the defendant has accepted the goods, then you're going to just be claiming in contract, not in restitution. If the defendant has requested the goods and then rejected the goods, again, you're just going to be claiming for a breach of contract. The defendant hasn't actually kept any goods that you can say they are unjustly enriched by. So really, it's only where the defendant keeps the goods, knowing that they're not free, that you have an opportunity to claim in restitution for unjust enrichment. So that's the issue of enrichment. The next issue is whether or not the unjust enrichment was at the plaintiff's expense. And this is just an interesting side note. Normally this issue won't be a problem for the plaintiff. They will normally have provided the money or services or whatever at their expense. But it's just something to note that because of the focus on restoring the defendant's unjust enrichment, the plaintiff has, on some very rare occasions, double-dipped. That is, they've recouped twice. So Commissioner of State Revenue and Royal Insurance Australia is the case to look at there if you have an idle moment in the middle of the night that you want to fill. The next issue is what is unjust, and as I said before, this is not just a fuzzy notion. You need to link this element up with a specific ground or unjust factor that's been previously recognised in the case law as providing sufficient injustice to warrant restitution of a benefit. So these recognised grounds are mistake, duress, legal compulsion, free acceptance of a benefit, total failure of consideration and illegality, and we'll be focusing here on total failure of consideration. Now, we have touched on total failure of consideration previously in the video series on frustration. You'll recall the Fibrosa and Fairbairn case, which was a case of supervening illegality, and a British company had contracted with a Polish company to sell some machinery. The Polish company had paid over about £1,000 odd. War broke out, Second World War, Germany invaded Poland, and the contract was frustrated because you couldn't contract with the enemy. In that case, it was held that the Polish company could get their £1,000 back. Why is that? Because it was a total failure of consideration. They didn't get any part of that machinery delivered to Poland. So we have touched on this briefly before. Arises mostly in cases of void contracts and contracts that are vitiated by elements like mistake. To constitute total failure of consideration, as it says, the failure has to be total. So if the plaintiff has received some of their consideration, you will get no restitution. The only possible way that you might get around this is if you can argue that the contract is severable, it is divisible, and there was a total failure of consideration in relation to one of those divisible or severable parts. Look at Roxburgh and Rothmans of Cornwall there. Otherwise, if the plaintiff gets any part of what they've contracted for, they're going to be left out in the cold, so to speak. And that's exactly what happened in the Baltic Shipping and Dillon case. And you'll recall this is the case we were talking about when we were discussing damages for mental distress. And poor old Mrs. Dillon had bought that ticket on the 14-day ill-fated cruise on the Mikhail Lermontov. The ship sank on the 9th day. She certainly got damages for mental distress. The question also was whether she could recover the purchase price of the ticket in restitution for total failure of consideration. In the lower court, it was held, yes, she certainly could recover the purchase price because the fare was paid in advance and the contract was entire. Also, the disaster that befell the ship entirely negated the prior 9 days worth of benefit. So the extreme nature of the disaster kind of cancelled out any benefit. I can certainly sympathise with that reasoning. On appeal, it was held that Mrs. Dillon could recover, but only for the balance of the fare for the days that she'd lost. On further appeal to the High Court, it was held no, she couldn't recover in restitution because she had the benefit of those 8 days prior to the ship sinking. So she got the damages for mental distress, no restitution for total failure of consideration in terms of her ticket money. Just one further thing to note about the Baltic shipping case, and that is that restitution lies outside the usual contractual relationship. It's not tied in any way to compensation for loss or damage. It's tied to those considerations of justice and equity, whether or not there has been unjust enrichment. And because of that, the court doesn't want you to double dip. So you'll normally need to elect between damages in contract and restitution at the time that judgment is handed down. So in the Baltic shipping case, the High Court said that the promisee, that is Mrs. Dillon, got full compensation for non-performance of the promise. That was, she got her damages in mental distress. She couldn't then turn around and claim also a refund of the ticket price on which performance was conditioned. Otherwise, if you think about it, she would have really been double dipping. She would have got the equivalent of performance of the promise, that is damages, without actually having to bear the expense that she had agreed to pay for it, that is the contract price. So that was a further ground on which restitution was denied to Mrs. Dillon there. I guess it makes sense, although you do have some sympathy for her plight. What are some defences that a defendant might come up with in order to avoid disgorgement? What a lovely word. Having to pay back the benefit they've received. Firstly, you can argue that the benefit was part of a valid gift or benefit that was provided under an obligation at law or in equity or under statute. For example, here, deposits are the classic one there, always intended to be forfeited. The other main one is change of position, and this is where the defendant argues that they've acted to their own detriment on the faith of having received this benefit, whatever they've received from the plaintiff. So it's now inequitable for the money to be returned. And the main case there is the Lipkin Gorman and Carpnail case. In this case, Mr. Case misappropriated over £300,000 from Lipkin Gorman, and he used this plus his own money to gamble away over £561,000 at a club. Mr. Case won £378,000. However, he lost about £154,000. So the club essentially had gained that £154,000 from the losing bets. What did Lipkin Gorman do? It sued the club in restitution for the club's gains, that is the money it made out of Case's losing bets. The club tried to argue this defence of change of position, and they said it had received the monies, these bets that Case had lost, but it had changed its position because it had actually paid out some of those monies to Case on his winning bets. The court said yes, okay, the club took a risk by taking Case's bets, but when Case lost, the club won. It had paid nothing to him on those losing bets. It had kept all of the money on those losing bets. So it was not inequitable to ask the club to repay Lipkin Gorman those monies, that is, the monies that it had made on the losing bets. Not too hard to get your head around, is it really? Not too surprising that they failed on the change of position argument there. A nice case to compare is the Citigroup and National Australia Bank case, and in that case, Citigroup had mistakenly transferred some monies to National Australia Bank. National Australia Bank avoided repaying the money in restitution because it had changed its position very clearly in that case by transferring onwards, forwarding on the money to another bank in Hong Kong. And so there, the defence succeeded. So that is the defence of change of position. The last thing that we need to discuss is quantum merit, and we've already been discussing quantum merit on and off in this video series, so I guess this is really just a summary of what we've discussed. Quantum merit is that lovely legal Latin for as much as she or he has earned. Really just want payment for whatever it is that you've done. It's available where a plaintiff does work or supplies goods or services to the defendant but has no contractual right to claim payment. For example, the contract didn't specify the price. That was Way and Latilla. Or the contract never eventuated or was frustrated. Remember Cadelpha Constructions. Or the contract was unenforceable. Pavey and Matthews and Paul. Or an entire contract was wrongfully discharged. That was Planchet and Coleman. In all those cases, it has to also be unconscionable. That is, the defendant would be unjustly enriched if the recipient retained the benefit that they had accepted without paying for it. Not too hard to wrap your head around, is it really? An interesting further little sub-branch of restitution remedies. So that is restitution. And the last thing we need to do today is quickly refresh our memory on the remedies available under the Australian Consumer Law for breach of Section 18, that is the misleading or deceptive conduct provision. No discussion on remedies really would be complete without a refresher on this, because the remedies are very powerful that you can get under the ACL. Section 232 is injunctions, 236 is damages. No real surprises there. It is the Section 237/243 remedies that you can get that really make remedies under the ACL something quite special. Looking at the legislation, Section 237 deals with compensation orders, and it says a court may, on application of a person who suffered loss because of the conduct of another person that was engaged in a contravention of a provision of Chapter 2, that is where Section 18 lives, so misleading or deceptive conduct, the court may make such order or orders as the court thinks appropriate against the person who engaged in the conduct or a person involved in that conduct. So you've got the primary defendant there as well as any of the accessories. Remember, you can also look to remedies from accessories to a breach to Section 18. Look at Note 2. The orders that the court may make may include all or any of the orders set out in Section 243. Now, this is where it really gets quite impressive. 243 deals with the kinds of orders that may be made, and it is an inclusive provision. That is, it's just there to give you an example or flavour of the kind of orders that a court might make. And have a look at these orders. They are really quite broad and very suited for being tailored to exactly the right remedy for the situation that the parties might find themselves in. An order declaring the whole or any part of a contract, look at sub 1, to be void, and sub 2, if the court thinks fit, to have been void ab initio from the beginning, or only void on and after such date as is specified in the order. So the court might preserve some of the contract and just chop the rest off and make it void. An order varying a contract in such manner as is specified in the order. Wow, so the court can actually rewrite the contract for the parties, and if the court thinks fit, only make that variation operative after a certain date. C, an order to refuse to enforce any or all of the provisions of the contract. D, refunds, repayment of money. Look at F, an order directing the respondent at their expense to repair or provide parts for goods that have been supplied. Something similar. G, an order directing the respondent at their expense to supply services to the injured party. Wow, so a very broad set of orders that might be made here. Again, that's just a flavour of the orders that might be made. Essentially, 237 and 243 allows the court to order whatever will best resolve the dispute between the parties. So they are the remedies under the ACL, and that is the issue of remedies. And that is the end of our unit. Thanks very much for watching these videos. As always, if you have any questions or queries, please shoot me an email or post something on Teams or on Facebook. Other than that, I look forward to catching up with you in a Zoom sometime soon, and it's been a pleasure teaching you contract law. Bye for now, guys.